The morning Gordon Bell told me my farm had become neighborhood property, I was standing barefoot on my back porch in a housecoat, holding a mug of coffee that tasted like burnt socks. He had sent the news by fax to the diner down the road, because I did not own one of those new fancy machines, and the girl at the counter handed it to me with the same face people use at funerals. According to a letter printed on Briarwood Estates letterhead, the 38 acres my family had worked since 1947 were now part of something called the Heritage Greenway. I read that page 3 times, then a 4th, because sometimes your eyes will lie to you before your mind is ready to accept the truth. It said that my pasture, my creek, my old tobacco barn, and the patch of pecan trees where my daddy taught me how to drive a truck had been designated for shared neighborhood recreation based on historical community use. Historical community use. That was a polite little way of saying people had been cutting through my land without asking, and Gordon Bell had decided that and made it theirs. Now, this was 1995, out in the small town called Millstone, Tennessee, where most people still knew who owned every dog, every tractor, and every bad decision made after midnight. We did not have neighborhood apps. We did not have group chats. We had kitchen telephones mounted to walls, bulletin boards of the Piggly Wiggly, and women who could spread news from one end of town to the other before your coffee cooled. So by 9 that morning, half of Millstone probably knew that Evelyn Harper had lost her mind over a walking trail, and the other half was waiting to see whether I would cry, sell, or set something on fire. I did none of those things, not that day anyway. I drove straight from the diner back to my place, folded that fax until it fit in my shirt pocket, and waited. I knew Gordon would come. Men like Gordon Bell never sent a letter without showing up afterward to enjoy the sound of their own authority. He arrived just before lunch in a burgundy Lincoln Town car that looked ridiculous on a gravel drive. The car rolled up slow, polished bright enough to reflect the sky, and behind it came a little white sedan carrying 2 members of the Briarwood board, a thin man named Curtis Vale and a woman named Sharon McKee, both dressed like they were going to church, not trying to take somebody's farm. Gordon stepped out first, all-pressed khakis and silver belt buckle, holding a rolled-up map under one arm like a preacher carrying the Bible. He had that kind of face some men get when they have spent too many years being agreed with. Smooth cheeks, neat grey hair, little smiles sitting there like he had already won something. He looked across my yard, past the porch swing my husband built before he died, over toward the fields, and he let out this long breath like he was admiring a painting he had just bought. I did not invite him in. I did not offer him sweet tea. I leaned against the porch post and said, "Morning, Gordon, you lose your way." He smiled. "Evelyn, I thought it would be better if we discussed the Heritage Greenway in person." I said, "You mean the part where you put your name on a piece of paper and tried to turn my land into a public park?" Sharon gave a little nervous laugh, the kind people make when they are hoping the grown-ups in the room will stop fighting. Gordon unrolled the map over the hood of his car. It showed Briarwood Estates in neat colored blocks, all those tidy brick houses with tiny lawns and matching mailboxes, and right beside it was my property, shaded green. My land, colored in like it belonged to a brochure. He tapped the page with one finger. "This has been part of the development vision from the beginning. The neighborhood was built around the idea of access to open space, creek views, walking paths, family recreation." I looked down at that map, then at him. "Funny thing about visions, Gordon. They usually belong to the person who owns the land." He did not like that. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened just a little. He started explaining that residents had walked near the creek for years, that some children had fished there, that the previous owners had always been friendly. That last part caught in my throat because the previous owner, he meant, was my father, and Daddy had been dead 11 years. My husband Ray had been gone too, and I suppose Gordon figured a 52-year-old widow living alone on a farm was supposed to be thankful when a man in a nice car explained what would happen to her future. He said, "Evelyn, nobody is trying to take anything from you. We are asking you to cooperate with what the community has already recognized." I said, "Community recognized what?" He spread his hands. "The value of the land." I stepped down off the porch then, slow and steady, and I walked right up to that map. "You want to talk about value, Gordon? My daddy paid off this place one crop at a time. My mama canned beans in that kitchen until her fingers cramped. Ray rebuilt that barn after a storm took half the roof. Said, 'Do not stand on my driveway.' Point to a colored line. and act like your neighborhood barbecue committee has more say in this land than the people buried under that hill. Curtis Vale looked down at his shoes. Sharon looked like she wished the ground would open. Gordon just rolled the mat back up and said, "The board has voted, Evelyn. We would prefer not to make this unpleasant." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Then you should have stayed home." That should have been the end of it. A normal person hears something like that and decides maybe this woman is serious. Maybe I ought to call a lawyer. Maybe I should stop pretending I can annex a farm with a photocopied map. But Gordon Bell was not a normal person. He was a man who had built his whole life around the belief that a nice voice and the firm handshake could move people wherever he wanted them. By the next morning, I found out just how far he was willing to go. I was feeding the horses when I heard tires on gravel. Then another set, then another. I walked out toward the front gate and saw a blue minivan parked beside my mailbox. A young couple got out with 2 little boys, a yellow Labrador, a cooler, folding chairs, the whole Sunday afternoon package. The father waved at me like we were neighbors at a church picnic. "Morning, ma'am," he called. We heard the greenway was open now. I stood there holding a bucket of feed in one hand and said, "The what?" He pointed toward the creek. Brywood sent out a flyer last night, said the trailer's ready for community use. We figured the boys could fish. I looked at the children, then at the dog pulling on its leash, then back at their father. They were not bad people. That was the worst part. They had been told a lie by somebody wearing a tie, and now they were standing on my property thinking they had been invited. So I took a breath and said, "Sir, I am sorry somebody sent you out here under false information, but this is private land. There is no greenway, there is no trail, and those boys need to stay clear of that creek because the bank drops off sharp in places." The mother looked embarrassed. The father looked confused. He said, "But Mr. Bell said the association had worked it out." I said, "Mr. Bell has worked out a whole lot of things in his own head." They left after that, polite enough, but not before the little boy asked me if he could at least pet my horse. I told him yes, because I was angry at Gordon, not at children. But after they drove away, I stood there looking at the dust hanging over my driveway, and I felt something settle into my chest. Not rage exactly. Rage burns hot and fast. This was colder. This was the moment I understood that Gordon was not asking for a footpath. He was testing how much of my life he could take before I pushed back. By noon, 3 more cars had come through. One woman brought a camera and said she was taking pictures for a church calendar. A man in a sleeveless shirt asked if the pond was stocked. 2 teenage girls came in carrying a blanket and a radio, saying they wanted somewhere quiet to sunbathe. Then, around 2 o'clock, I heard the sound of the lawnmower engine where no lawnmower ought to have been. I walked toward the south pasture and found a man named Eddie Larch, one of Briarwood's maintenance contractors, dragging a mower through the tall grass near the creek. He had a little sign in the back of his truck that said Heritage Greenway. I remember looking at him for a long second because I honestly thought my mind had started making up things. He shut off the mower, wiped his forehead and said, "Mrs. Harper, Mr. Bell said to clear a path along the water." I said, "Eddie, you have known me 20 years. Do you see a contract in my hand?" He shook his head. "No, ma'am." "Do you see a gate open?" "No, ma'am." "Do you see a gate open?" "No, ma'am." "Then why are you mowing my field?" He looked miserable. "Mr. Miserable." Bell said it was taken care of. I said, "Well, it is about to be." I let Eddie leave. I did not scream at him. He had a wife, 2 girls, and a boss who had probably told him this was routine work. But I kept the sign. I pulled it out of the back of his truck, laid it on the hood of my old Ford, and stared at those words until they stopped looking like a mistake, and started looking like a mistake. That afternoon I called Ruth Haskins. Ruth had been my closest friend since high school, though she'd become one of those people who wore sensible shoes and kept legal pads in her purse, so calling her now meant I was serious. She was the kind of lawyer who could make a courthouse clerk apologize for breathing too loud. I left a message on her answering machine, and she called me back about 20 minutes later from our office. I said, "Ruth, I need you to tell me whether a homeowners association can steal a farm because people like looking at it." There was a pause on the line, then she said, "Evelyn, what happened?" I told her everything. The letter, the map, the visitors, Eddie and the mower, Gordon standing on my driveway talking about community recognition like he had been elected mayor of the moon. When I finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not touch that sign. Do not throw away the facts. Do not argue with him alone again. Take photographs of every car, every person, every flyer you can get your hands on. and tomorrow morning meet me at the county records office." I said, "You think he has filed something?" She said, "I think Gordon Bell is the kind of man who mistakes paperwork for ownership. Let's find out how much paper he has." I barely slept that night. I sat at the kitchen table with Ray's old flannel shirt draped over the back of his chair, listening to the refrigerator hum and the clock tick, thinking about all the years I had spent trying to keep this place running. My daddy used to say, "Land does not ask much of you, but it asks every day. Feed the animals, mend the fence, watch the weather, pay the taxes, patch the roof before the rain gets there. It does not care if you are grieving. It does not care if you are tired. It just waits for you to show up." And I had shown up every day since Ray died. Even on the mornings I did not want to get out of bed. I had shown up when the well pump broke, when the roof leaked, when the old tractor threw a belt in the middle of hay season. I had shown up because it was mine. That was the part Gordon did not understand. He saw 38 acres. I saw a life. Meidel. The county records office was in an old brick building behind the courthouse, with crooked fluorescent lights and a fan that made more noise than wind. Ruth was already there when I arrived, wearing a navy suit and holding a cup of gas station coffee. She had 3 yellow pads under one arm and that look in her eye that meant somebody was about to regret lying to her. We spent 4 hours going through deed books, survey maps, tax records, old plats, and every file connected to Briarwood Estates. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Gentry, who had worked in that office since Nixon was president, started out acting bored. Then she saw the name Gordon Bell on the paperwork, and her whole face changed. She looked at Ruth, then at me and said, "Well now, that is interesting." She pulled out a folder that had been filed less than a month earlier. Inside was an application from Briarwood Estates requesting recognition of a recreational access corridor along the northern boundary of the subdivision. It used a map that looked official at first glance, but when Ruth laid it next to my actual property survey, the difference was plain as day. Gordon had taken a narrow county drainage easement that ran beside the public road, then stretched the green shading across my pasture and down to the creek. He had not just colored in a map. He had altered a boundary. He had attached affidavits from 2 residents claiming they had used the land for recreation for more than 10 years. One of those residents was his brother-in-law. The other was a man who had moved into Briarwood 8 months earlier. Ruth looked at the papers for a long time. Then she said, "This is not a mistake. This is a plan." That was when Mrs. Misselpan Gentry quietly pulled another file from the cabinet. It was a stack of promotional materials from the original Briarwood development proposal, all glossy drawings and smiling families. There it was on the front page, big as life. Heritage Greenway, private creek access, nature trail, family commons. Gordon had been selling homes with a view of land he did not own. He had promised people something that belonged to me, and once enough of them bought houses expecting it, he figured he could bully me into making it real. I remember sitting at that table with my hands folded in my lap, feeling sick in a way I had not felt since the night Ray died. Because grief and betrayal have something in common. They both make the world look familiar for a second, and then suddenly realize the room you are standing in is not the room you thought it was. Ruth reached across the table and touched my wrist. "Evelyn, listen to me. You did not cause this, and you do not have to fix the mess he made, but you do need to stop treating Gordon like he's a nuisance. He is creating a paper trail to pressure you into giving him access. We are going to create a paper trail that makes him wish he had never learned your name." I said, "What do we do first?" She smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. "We make sure nobody can pretend they did not know the truth." That afternoon, Ruth drafted letters to every member of the Briarwood board, to their insurance carrier, to the county planning office, and to the developer who still owned 9 unsold lots in the neighborhood. She sent them by certified mail, because in 1995, certified mail was the closest thing we had to looking somebody in the eye and saying, "I will see you in court." The letter did not threaten anyone. It simply stated the facts. My land was private, the HOA had no recorded easement, the map being circulated was false. Any further entry onto my property would be documented as trespass. And because Briarwood had publicly claimed access rights over my land, its board and insurer might be responsible for damages arising from injuries, accidents, maintenance, and misrepresentation. Ruth also wrote one sentence that made me smile when I read it. It said, "Any party who continues to market private property as a community amenity does so at their own financial peril." Gordon got that letter 2 days later. I know because he came roaring up my driveway before dinner, this time alone, with the windows down and his tie loosened. He did not even park straight. He got out of the Lincoln holding Ruth's letter in one hand, and I could tell before he said a word that the polite act had slipped. I was in the yard hanging sheets on the line because even when a man is trying to steal your farm, laundry does not stop. He marched toward me and said, "You have made a serious mistake." I clipped another sheet to the line. "Have I? You are turning this into a legal issue." I laughed at that, not loud, just enough to let him know I had heard the ridiculousness of it. "Gordon, you filed fake maps with the county and sent strangers onto my property. What exactly did you think this was?" His face tightened. "You are jeopardizing the community." "No, I am jeopardizing your brochure." That landed. I saw it in his eyes. For the first time, he looked scared, not ashamed. Men like Gordon do not get ashamed until they are already caught. But scared, yes. He took a step closer and lowered his voice. "You do not understand how much money is tied up in this neighborhood." I said, "No, I understand it just fine. You sold people a promise that was never yours to make. Now you need me to clean it up for you." He pointed at my house. "You could make a deal. We could compensate you. Give you a fair price." I stopped what I was doing and turned to face him. "You think this is about price?" He said nothing. I told him, "This house is where I brought my babies home. That barn is where my husband asked me to marry him after he had mud up to his knees and hay stuck in his hair. That field is where my father had a heart attack and still managed to cuss me for calling an ambulance. You do not get to walk in here after lying to your neighbors and decide there is a number that makes that disappear." I stared at me for a moment, then said something that I will never forget. He said, "You are alone out here, Evelyn. Do not make this harder than it has to be." I do not know what he expected. Maybe tears, maybe fear, maybe a woman to live down at the ground and start calculating whether she could afford a fight. But something inside me went very still. I walked to the clothes basket, picked up Ray's old work shirt, and held it against my chest for just a second. Then I looked at Gordon and said, "I was alone the day Ray died. I was alone the first winter when the pipes froze. I was alone when the tractor threw a wheel in the rain and I had to walk half a mile for help. You are not the first hard thing that has happened to me, Gordon Bell. You are just the first one wearing loafers." He stood there, red in the face, and then he got back in his car and left hard enough to throw gravel onto my lawn. The next week turned into a war of paper, telephones, and people pretending they were not nervous. Briarwood residents started receiving copies of the letters Ruth had sent. Their phones rang. Their mortgages got mentioned. Their insurance questions got raised. Gordon tried to reassure them with another newsletter, this one printed on cream paper and delivered in mailboxes under the title, "Protecting Our Community Vision." He claimed I had become hostile, that I was obstructing family access to a shared neighborhood asset, that I was being manipulated by outside attorneys. I got a copy from a woman named Lena Morales, who lived 3 houses down from the entrance to Briarwood. Lena had been one of the people who came to fish with her boys that first day. She showed up at my gate carrying the newsletter and a peach pie. "I owe you an apology," she said. "For what?" I asked. She held up the paper. "For believing him." I let her in. We sat on the porch, and she told me that her husband had bought their house because the brochure showed a creek path and green space. They had thought it meant their boys could grow up running around outside instead of being stuck on a cul-de-sac. She said, "I was mad at you at first. I thought you were just being selfish. But then I asked Gordon to show me where the access was recorded, and he got angry. That is when I knew something was wrong." I told her I understood. Most people wanted to believe the person in charge was telling the truth. It is easier that way. Lena looked out over the pasture and said, "What can we do?" I said, "Tell the truth when somebody asks." That was all. I did not need an army. I needed people to stop letting Gordon speak for them. Meanwhile, I put up new no trespassing signs along the road and locked the north gate. I installed 2 motion lights over the barn and borrowed my cousin's camcorder, one of those heavy VHS things that made you look like you were filming a school play. Every night I set it in the kitchen window facing the driveway. Every morning I checked the tape. It was mostly deer, raccoons, and one fat stray dog that kept digging under the fence. But on the 4th night, the camera caught Gordon's maintenance crew coming down the road just after midnight. They were carrying stakes and a metal sign. "Heritage Greenway entrance." They planted it beside my gate, right in front of the no trespassing sign, like they were trying to overwrite reality with a bigger font. I watched the tape twice before I called Ruth. She came out before sunrise, still in her robe under a trench coat, and watched it with me in the kitchen. When the men on the screen hammered in that sign, Ruth leaned back in her chair and said, "Well, that is helpful." By noon, the sheriff had been to my place. Sheriff Donnelly was a big man with a sunburned neck and the tired look of somebody who had spent 30 years settling fights about dogs, fences, and people who should know better. He watched the tape, stood at the gate, looked at the sign and said, "Miss Evelyn, I do not know what Gordon thinks he is doing, but I know he is doing it on your property." He made a report. He called the maintenance company. He told them to remove the sign. And when Gordon arrived 10 minutes later, furious and sweating through his shirt, the sheriff told him in plain language that he needed to stay off my land until a court decided otherwise. Gordon said, "This is an HOA matter." Sheriff Donnelly said, "No, son, this is a private property matter, and I have been doing this job long enough to know the difference." Gordon looked like he wanted to argue, but he did not. Not with the sheriff standing there, not with Ruth beside me holding that tape like a loaded gun. He left again, but I could see the calculation in his face. He was not quitting. He was changing tactics. 2 days later, the Briarwood board called an emergency neighborhood meeting at the clubhouse. They said it was to clear up misinformation. Ruth told me not to go unless I wanted to. She said I was not obligated to walk into a room full of people who had been lied to about me. But I had spent too many nights sitting alone in my kitchen, wondering what Gordon was saying above me behind closed doors. So I put on my best blue dress, the one I wore to Ray's funeral and my daughter's college graduation, and I drove over there with Ruth. The clubhouse was packed, men standing along the back wall, women fanning themselves with newsletters, retirees clutching folders, young parents whispering about bills. Gordon stood at the front beneath a framed picture of Briarwood Estates, looking every bit like a man trying to keep a roof from falling in. The moment I walked through the door, the room went quiet. He looked at me and said, "Mrs. Harper, this meeting is for association members." I smiled and said, "Well, according to your map, part of my property is in your association. I figured I ought to see what I am paying for." A few people laughed. Gordon did not. He tapped his gavel and started talking about community harmony, long-term investment, shared spaces, and difficult personalities. He never said my name at first, but he did not have to. Then he pulled out a board and showed a new drawing of the Heritage Greenway. It had paths, benches, picnic tables, a little bridge over the creek, even a place marked Family Activity Lawn. He talked about how it would improve property values. He talked about how it would give children a safer place to play. He talked about how the land had always been intended for the community. Then Lena stood up. She had both hands shaking, but her voice did not. She said, "Can you show us where the association owns it?" Gordon looked at her for a second. "Lena, this is not the time for legal technicalities," she said. "That is not what I asked." The room got quieter. A man near the front, a retired electrician named Frank Sutter, stood up next. Frank had lived in Millstone longer than anybody I knew. He said, "I worked on the first water line out there in 1978. That is Harperland, always has been." Gordon smiled like he was speaking to a child. "Mr. Sutter, property arrangements change." Frank said, "Not without a deed, they do not." That was when Ruth stood up. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She walked to the front, laid 3 folders on the table and said, "My name is Ruth Haskins. I represent Evelyn Harper. I have here the current deed, the original survey, the county tax records, the unrecorded map Mr. Bell submitted, and video of Briarwood contractors installing signage on private land after receiving written notice not to enter." Gordon tried to interrupt. Ruth held up one hand. "Please do not. You have had enough time to speak." Then she looked at the crowd and said, "You deserve to know what this situation could cost you. If the association continues to claim this land, it may be exposed to claims for trespass, false representation, insurance coverage, and every injury that happens on a property it does not own. You may also wish to ask why homes were marketed using access to land that was never part of the development." That was the moment the room changed. You could feel it. It was like somebody opened a window in a stale house. People stopped looking at me and started looking at Gordon. A woman near the front said, "You told us this was already arranged." A man with a baby on his knee said, "You said there would be no extra fees." Someone else shouted, "My wife bought that house because of the trail." Gordon tried to hold the room together. He said there had been misunderstandings, that negotiations were ongoing, that the board had acted in good faith. Then Sharon McKee stood up from the table beside him. Poor Sharon. She had looked sick for the whole meeting. She opened her purse, pulled out a stack of papers, and laid them down in front of everybody. I did not know the map was Oxford, she said. Gordon turned toward her slowly. Sharon. She looked at him with tears in her eyes. You told us the county had approved it. You told us Mrs. Harper had been contacted months ago. You told us there was an easement. Gordon said, this is not the place. Sharon said, no, this is exactly the place. She held up a bill from a drafting company in Nashville. It listed map revisions, lot value enhancement, and creek access presentation. The date was 6 months before the neighborhood newsletter. 6 months before he ever spoke to me. 6 months before any so-called community vote. He had planned the whole thing. He'd used my land to sell houses, then tried to turn the buyers into pressure against me when the lie started coming apart. Gordon looked around that room and realized nobody was listening to him anymore. The men who had nodded along with him for years were now staring at the floor. The women who had trusted the newsletters were whispering to each other. The people he thought were his community had finally understood. They were not partners in his vision. They were shields. Ding, I had imagined that moment 100 times while lying awake at night. I thought I would feel victorious. I thought I would want to stand there and make some grand speech about justice and property rights and how nobody takes what belongs to me. But when it finally happened, when Gordon Bell stood at the front of that clubhouse with his little gavel and his polished shoes and nowhere left to hide, I mostly felt tired. Tired in the bones. Tired in the way you feel after a storm passes and you walk outside to see what is still standing. Gordon tried one last time. He said, you people do not understand what you are destroying. I looked at him and said, no, Gordon. We understand exactly what you built. Then Frank Sutter stood up and said, I move we remove Gordon Bell as president of Briarwood Estates effective immediately. The room was silent for maybe 1 second. Then Mina said, second. After that, hands went up everywhere. Some people stood, some people clapped. Somebody in the back said, finally. Gordon did not get thrown out of the room. There was no dramatic sheriff escort, no television cameras, no big movie ending. He just stood there while the people he had spent years managing voted him out in less than 5 minutes. That was enough. Sometimes the worst thing that can happen to a man like Gordon is not losing money. It is losing the audience. The lawsuit took months after that. Real life is not as quick as stories make it sound. There were depositions, letters, insurance adjusters, county meetings, and enough paperwork to fill my dining room table. Briarwood settled the trespass claim, withdrew every false filing, and sent written notices to residents confirming that my land was private. Gordon resigned from the development company before the year was over. I heard he moved to Florida, though I do not know if that is true. In a town like Millstone, people will tell you a thing happened enough times that eventually it feels true whether it did or not. What I do know is that the Heritage Greenway sign never went back up. The board changed. Sharon stayed on, to her credit, and Lena joined later. They cleaned up the old rules, opened the books, and stopped acting like a homeowners association was a tiny government with a crown. About a year after all of it ended, Lena came out to see me again. It was October. The pecan leaves were turning gold, and I was standing by the barn sorting apples into baskets. She brought her boys with her. They were bigger by then, louder too. She said the neighborhood wanted to host a fall picnic, but this time they wanted to ask, not assume. I looked at those boys, and I looked at the field where their father had once parked with a cooler, because Gordon told him he could. Part of me wanted to say no. Part of me wanted to close the gate forever and let every person in Briarwood remember exactly what it felt like to be told they were not welcome. But then I thought about my daddy. He was stubborn as a mule, but he was not mean. He used to say there was a difference between protecting a fence and building a prison, so I told Lena, you can have your picnic. One afternoon, you ask first. You leave the place cleaner than you found it, and nobody brings a map. She laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. That fall, I opened the gate myself. People came with casseroles, folding chairs, homemade pies, and more children than I could count. They fished in the creek under supervision. They played baseball in the lower field. They ate barbecue under the pecan trees. And the strangest thing was, it did not feel like losing anything, because for the first time, it was happening on my terms. I was not being pushed aside. I was choosing to share something that belonged to me, and there is a world of difference between those two things. I still live on that farm. The porch swing still creaks. The old truck still pulls to the left. Ray's work shirt is still hanging in the closet because I've never been able to put it away. The creek still runs behind the barn, and every now and then I see somebody slow down by the road and look out at the fields. Maybe they wonder what happened here. Maybe they remember. Maybe they have heard the story and think I was too hard on Gordon Bell. Some people have told me I should have sold him an easement. Others have said I should have taken every dime he had and never let another Briarwood resident step foot on my land again. I do not know that there is one clean answer. I only know this. A community is not built by taking from the person with the least power in the room. It is built by asking, listening, and understanding that a boundary is not an insult. Sometimes it is the only thing keeping people honest. So tell me what you think. Was I right to fight Gordon the way I did? Or should I have made a deal and let the trail happen? And when does a neighborhood trying to improve itself cross the line into deciding that somebody else has to pay the price? Put your thoughts in the comments, because I have a feeling this is one of those stories where people are going to see the same fence and stand on very different sides of it.